They buried this name in the margins for a reason. If you're listening now, understand this. Once you hear it, you won't unhear it, and something in you will start watching the world differently. Picture Virginia before dawn. Not the postcard version. Not columns and magnolias. I mean the damp breath of swamps, the kind that rot boots and swallow screams. Somewhere between the Great Dismal and the ledger rooms of Tidewater plantations, a truth was written 17 times and then quietly hidden. Same man, different handwriting, as if each clerk wanted distance from what they were recording. 94 human beings dragged back into chains. 94 failures of hope. And the hunter who found them was himself enslaved. This is not a story about cruelty alone. This is a story about systems. About how power learns to outsource its violence. About how institutions discover that the most efficient weapon is a man forced to betray himself. They called him Solomon Crow. Not because he chose that name, but because names are assigned like tools when you are owned. He was purchased not to plant or harvest, but to hunt, to think, to track, to predict the desperate logic of men running for their lives. And he did it so well that plantation owners began hiding the evidence, afraid that if the pattern was seen clearly enough, it would expose something monstrous about the machinery they relied on. Here is the first truth they never taught you. The most ruthless systems do not only break bodies. They redesign incentives. They manufacture impossible choices and call them survival. They turn victims into instruments and then wash their hands of the outcome. Solomon was not celebrated publicly. He was whispered about. County clerks complained about irregular bounty payments. Investigations were opened and then smothered. No trial. No questions. Because to ask how one enslaved man could outperform professional slave catchers was to risk discovering how much terror can be extracted from a human soul when his family is used as collateral. You are going to hear people call Solomon a traitor. Others will call him a victim. Both labels are safe. Both prevent you from seeing the deeper mechanism at work. What mattered to the system was not his morality, but his effectiveness. His willingness to become the blade pointed at his own people. And as we go further, understand this. This is not ancient history. This pattern never disappeared. It only learned new uniforms, new language, new excuses. Stay with me. What comes next is where the descent truly begins. The Tidewater region in the late 1830s was a dying organism pretending to be eternal. The soil was exhausted, the aristocracy indebted, and the illusion of control was slipping through their fingers like dry earth. Escape was no longer a rumor, it was a pattern. Men and women vanished into swamps, into forests, into whispered routes that bent northward like a compass needle drawn to freedom. Every disappearance was a reminder that the system was leaking. Richard Fairmont understood this better than most. He was not a sadist in the theatrical sense. He was something colder. A manager. A man who believed morality was irrelevant when weighed against efficiency. To him, enslaved people were assets and escape was theft. 19 losses in 14 months was not a tragedy to him, it was a balance sheet crisis. Professional slave catchers were blunt instruments. Expensive, careless, predictable. They didn't think like the hunted because they had never been hunted. And this is where the system made its most dangerous evolution. Fairmont did not want a brute. He wanted insight. He wanted someone who could read fear the way a general reads terrain. At a forced auction in Richmond, Fairmont saw the notation that mattered. Not height, not strength, literacy, tracking, dialects.
Coopérative disposition.
That last phrase should chill you. Cooperative does not mean willing. It means conditioned. It means a man who has learned that resistance only multiplies pain. Solomon stood on the block without protest because protest had been trained out of him. His calm was not submission. It was calculation. He answered questions precisely without emotion, because emotion had never saved him. Fairmont paid triple the going rate because he was not buying labor. He was buying leverage. Here is the bargain that defined everything that followed. Solomon would be housed separately, fed better, treated differently, and in exchange, his wife and children held on another plantation would be purchased and reunited with him. Fail and they would be sold south. Louisiana. Sugar. A death sentence with paperwork. This is how systems ensure obedience. Not with chains alone, but with hostage-taking disguised as opportunity. They offer just enough hope to make compliance feel like responsibility. They make survival look like choice. Solomon accepted because refusal was not heroic, it was annihilation. And in that moment, the machine did what it always does. It turned a man's love into a weapon against him. What Fairmont never bothered to uncover was Solomon's origin. Because origins only matter when you believe people are human. Solomon had been born free, Delaware, son of a carpenter who had papers, skills, and a modest life. Freedom did not protect him. At 12 years old, while visiting relatives in Maryland, he was taken. Kidnapped by men who specialized in erasing identities. His papers destroyed. His name reassigned. His future auctioned. 18 years of captivity followed. And Solomon learned quickly that survival required more than strength. It required observation. He studied overseers the way scholars study texts. He learned how fear travels, how desperation leaves patterns, how hope makes men reckless. Tracking was not a passion. It was an ultimatum. Serve or watch your family dismantled piece by piece. So he learned, and he became exceptional. Not because he enjoyed it, but because being average meant being disposable. Every skill he acquired pushed him further from the fields and deeper into a role that demanded the erosion of his own soul. When Solomon arrived at Fairmont's estate, the quarters already knew his reputation. Word moves faster than chains. To them, he was not complex. He was the hunter, the collaborator, the man who had chosen proximity to power over solidarity. They did not know about the hostage bargain. They did not know about the ledger he kept in his head, counting every compromise. This is another truth worth sitting with. Systems depend on enforced ignorance among the oppressed. If everyone understood the full structure of coercion, unity might form. So knowledge is fragmented. Everyone sees only the piece that wounds them directly. Solomon kept to himself. He did not boast. He did not threaten. He watched. Fairmont gave him a horse, a rifle, and a bloodhound named Judge. Tools with symbolic weight. Speed, distance, judgment. Even the dog seemed uneasy around him, obedient but never affectionate, as if it sensed the contradiction in its master. The estate was already preparing escape. Networks existed. Information flowed quietly through kitchens and workshops. A coordinated departure was planned. Solomon's presence destabilized everything. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the outsider, it is the one who understands you completely. And when the first man disappeared after Solomon's arrival, everyone knew what it meant. The hunt was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Marcus vanished with an 8-hour head start, enough time to believe in miracles. Enough time to reach the edge of the swamp, where the land dissolves into black water and the rules change. The Great Dismal was not just geography, it was a psychological threshold. Those who entered it were choosing uncertainty over certainty, danger over guaranteed suffering. Solomon followed the trail with mechanical precision. Broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, a footprint pressed too deeply by exhaustion. Judge pulled against the lead, eager, instinct doing what instinct does best. And Solomon led it, because resisting the role only increased suspicion. But understand this, obedience does not erase internal conflict. It buries it. Solomon thought of his children as he rode. Mercy, Isaac, ages frozen in his mind because memory was safer than imagining what they might look like now. He remembered his wife's question from years earlier, how do you live with yourself, and felt it echo with every mile. Near the swamp's edge, Solomon stopped. Tied the dog. Saturday. opened a small journal he was never meant to possess. For every person he had returned, he wrote a line. Not justification, acknowledgement, names as gravestones. Marcus was 94. This pause was not mercy. It was recognition. A moment where Solomon allowed himself to see the full weight of what he was doing before continuing anyway. That is how systems break men, not by removing their conscience, but by forcing them to act against it repeatedly until guilt becomes background noise. Halfway down this descent, you need to do something. Comment the phrase, "I see the machine twice." Not once, twice. This is not superstition. It is commitment. A signal that you are following the pattern, not just consuming a story. Solomon resumed the hunt because stopping would not save his children. Because hesitation had consequences. Because the system had already ensured that every path forward required loss. When he found Marcus, there was no chase left. Just truth. Marcus asked to be released into the water. Solomon said what the system had trained him to say, "I can't. They have my children." In that exchange, there were no villains. Only casualties arranged in a hierarchy of despair. Marcus extended his hands because hope had reached its limit. Dignity, even in surrender, was the last thing the system couldn't confiscate. Solomon bound him carefully, not cruelly, because cruelty was unnecessary. The outcome was already decided. They returned to Fairmont under cover of night. Torches waiting. Punishment already being discussed as policy, not anger. Solomon handed over the rope and walked away as if he were the one in chains. Fairmont emerged satisfied, calculating savings, blind to the moral cost because cost was measured only in currency. From the quarters, Celia watched. She understood immediately that their timeline had collapsed. Plans built on secrecy do not survive when someone inside the system knows every route, every trick, every hope. Solomon's existence forced a reckoning. Accelerate or die trying. What Fairmont never noticed was that Solomon was doing something else. Every hunt taught him more about the system's blind spots. Every pursuit revealed how power moved, where it assumed compliance, where it grew lazy. The same intelligence that made him dangerous to fugitives was making him dangerous to the institution itself. This is the final truth of this segment. Systems that rely on forced betrayal eventually create their own undoing. A man who understands oppression intimately is never fully owned, no matter how tight the leash appears. Knowledge accumulates, patterns emerge, and even the most conditioned instrument begins to recognize the architecture of the cage. Solomon Crow was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a pressure point, a living contradiction the system needed and feared simultaneously. And when a system depends on someone it cannot fully control, collapse becomes a matter of time. What happened next was not redemption. It was something far more dangerous. Because once a man sees the entire machine clearly, he is no longer just surviving it. He is learning how to break it. What broke the illusion was not a dramatic act of rebellion. It was silence. A silence that followed Solomon everywhere after Marcus was returned. The quarters no longer whispered around him, they closed. Eyes averted. Conversations ended. Isolation is the system's secondary punishment, inflicted by those who can afford no other defense. Solomon accepted it because isolation was familiar. He had lived inside it for years. But in that quiet, something dangerous was forming. Knowledge without outlet becomes strategy. Solomon began mapping Fairmont's operations in his mind the way others mapped escape routes. Patrol schedules, overseer habits, how long it took for messages to travel between plantations, which county clerks looked the other way, and which demanded bribes to do so. He noticed how bounty payments lagged, how paperwork vanished, how Fairmont falsified losses to protect himself from creditors. The machine was not seamless. It was tired, and Solomon could feel the strain. He began altering hunts subtly, extending search times just enough to allow distance, misreading trails without appearing incompetent, teaching Judge to circle wide, to contaminate scent lines. Small deviations, plausible errors. Each one bought someone hours, sometimes days. Not freedom but possibility. And possibility is radioactive to oppressive systems. Celia noticed first. Patterns in who was caught quickly and who vanished deeper than expected. Abel noticed next. When supplies he hid remained undiscovered longer than they should have. They did not trust Solomon, but they began to understand him. Not as an ally but as a fault line. The system responded the way it always does when control weakens. Fairmont tightened rules, increased surveillance, reduced rations. Pressure flows downhill, but pressure also reveals structure. And Solomon now saw clearly that Fairmont's greatest vulnerability was not violence, it was debt. Desperation masquerading as authority. In private moments, Solomon returned to his journal. 94 names. 94 weights. He did not write excuses. He wrote facts, because facts endure longer than absolution. And as he wrote, something crystallized. Survival alone was no longer enough. If his children were to inherit anything other than fear, the machine itself had to be confronted. Not attacked head-on. Undermined. Exposed. Starved. The most dangerous men are not those who rage against power, but those who understand it well enough to let it destroy itself. The breaking point came quietly, as all real fractures do. Fairmont failed to deliver. The year passed. Then another month. Excuses replaced promises. Market conditions. Legal delays. Solomon understood immediately what this meant. The bargain was never meant to be honored. It was a leash, not a contract. For the first time, Solomon allowed himself to imagine a future where compliance did not save his children. That realization was liberating in the most terrifying way possible. When survival no longer guarantees safety, fear loses leverage. He made contact with Celia not through confession, but through action. He left information where only someone already paying attention would find it. Patrol gap. A mislabeled map. A ledger discrepancy. Celia understood the language. Abel did too. The escape plan was no longer about 8 people. It was about collapse. Solomon fed Fairmont just enough success to maintain trust while quietly sabotaging his credibility with neighboring planters. Runaways crossed boundaries. Bounties went unpaid. Complaints accumulated. Investigations reopened. This time, they did not close as quickly. When Fairmont was finally audited, the ledgers told a story he could not control. Missing funds, irregular payments, illegal detentions. Solomon had ensured copies existed elsewhere. The same bureaucracy that had protected Fairmont now turned on him. Not out of morality but self-preservation. During the chaos, the escape happened. Not heroic. Not cinematic. Just precise. People disappeared into night, into swamp, into the cracks Solomon had widened. Some were caught later. Some were not. History rarely records percentages, only outcomes. Solomon did not escape with them. He stayed. Because his children were still leverage. But the system around him had changed. Fairmont was ruined. Sold off. Fragmented. Authority dispersed. In the confusion, Solomon leveraged what he had always leveraged best. Usefulness. Within months, his family was moved. Not reunited, transferred, but alive. And alive is the currency of survival. Solomon Crow vanished from the ledgers after 1847. No death record. No sale. Just absence. The most honest entry of all. Here is what you are meant to carry forward. Solomon's story was buried not because it was unique, but because it was instructional. It reveals how domination actually functions. Not through monsters alone, but through manufactured dilemmas. Through the strategic weaponization of love. Through forcing men to choose between their values and their blood. This is why institutions fear introspection more than rebellion. A rebel can be crushed. The thinker adapts. Solomon was dangerous because he learned faster than the system could evolve. because he understood that power always overreaches when it believes compliance is permanent. You live in a different century, but the architecture is familiar. Incentives over ethics, survival framed as loyalty, betrayal reframed as responsibility. The language has changed. The mechanics have not. The lesson is not to judge Solomon. Judgment is a luxury for those never placed in impossible positions. The lesson is to recognize the machine when it offers you a bargain that costs you yourself. To understand that systems prefer you divided, isolated, ashamed, and grateful for scraps of safety. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it.